The safe isn't empty. The little girl's whisper was so soft it almost disappeared beneath the quiet hum of the antique grandfather clock. Yet somehow it landed in the center of the room with the weight of a thunderclap. Every conversation stopped. Every polished shoe seemed frozen against the gleaming walnut floor. Nathaniel Whitmore slowly lifted his eyes from the massive steel safe built into the library wall of Whitmore Manor, his fingers still resting on the heavy circular handle that had refused to reveal anything except cold, empty shelves. The family attorney had already cleared his throat twice and declared that the final compartment contained nothing of value. His younger sister, Claudia Whitmore, folded her arms with practiced patience, the faint smile on her face suggesting that the disappointing discovery merely confirmed what everyone already believed. The estate had been inventoried. Every account had been audited. Every document had been cataloged. There were no hidden surprises left behind by the late Charles Whitmore, or so everyone thought. Nathaniel turned toward the tiny voice. Standing quietly beside one of the towering bookcases was an 8-year-old black girl wearing neatly braided hair tied with faded blue ribbons. Her name was Ava Brooks. She stood almost hidden behind a carved oak globe that had decorated the library longer than anyone could remember. She wasn't supposed to be inside the room at all. Her grandmother had once worked in the mansion's housekeeping department decades earlier, and today Ava had accompanied her mother, Denise Brooks, who had been invited back only to collect several keepsakes Charles Whitmore had requested she receive after his passing. Ava lowered her eyes for only a moment before looking directly at Nathaniel again. She wasn't frightened. She wasn't trying to interrupt. She simply looked certain. "The safe isn't empty," she repeated, barely louder than before. Claudia released a polite laugh that echoed against the high ceiling. "She's imagining things," she said smoothly. "Children see mysteries everywhere." A few distant relatives exchanged amused glances, grateful for something to ease the uncomfortable silence surrounding the reading of the estate documents. The attorney adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat once more. "Mr. Whitmore, we've completed 3 separate inspections. The interior is exactly as it appears." Nathaniel looked back into the safe. Rows of brushed steel reflected the warm glow from the crystal chandelier above, creating the illusion of endless silver walls. Empty. Perfectly empty. Yet something about the little girl's voice unsettled him. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't desperate. It carried the calm certainty of someone remembering a simple fact rather than inventing an exciting story. "Why do you think that?" Nathaniel asked gently. Ava stepped forward one cautious pace. "Because empty things don't make that sound." Several eyebrows lifted. Nathaniel frowned slightly. "What sound?" Ava pointed toward the open safe. "When you closed it halfway, it sounded different from the first time." Nathaniel blinked. He honestly couldn't remember hearing anything unusual, but she had noticed. His father had once told him that children sometimes observed details adults overlooked because adults were usually too busy deciding what mattered before they actually looked. That memory drifted back with surprising clarity. Charles Whitmore had repeated that lesson often during Nathaniel's childhood walks through the estate gardens. "Listen before you judge," his father used to say. Nathaniel slowly pushed the heavy door halfway, closed again. The thick hinges moved with a deep metallic whisper. Then he opened it once more. Silence settled across the library. Ava tilted her head slightly. "There," she said. Nathaniel heard only a faint echo, almost like a second click arriving an instant after the first. It was subtle enough that he might have ignored it entirely on any other day. Claudia smiled patiently. "Old safes make noises, Nathaniel. That's hardly surprising." But Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crouched slightly until his eyes met Ava's. "How did you notice that?" Ava looked toward the shelves lining the walls from floor to ceiling. "My mom says old houses remember things. If something sounds different, it's because something changed." Denise, standing quietly near the doorway, looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "She's always asking questions." Nathaniel offered a small smile. "Questions aren't something to apologize for." The attorney glanced at his watch. "Mr. Whitmore, we still have signatures to complete." Nathaniel nodded without looking away from the safe. The library itself seemed to breathe around them. Afternoon sunlight filtered through enormous leaded glass windows, painting ribbons of gold across Persian rugs that had survived generations. Dust floated lazily through the beams of light, giving the room the quiet dignity of a place where history preferred whispers over speeches. Ava's eyes wandered toward an old portrait hanging above the fireplace. Charles Whitmore stood smiling beside a much younger Nathaniel, one hand resting on the shoulder of a longtime employee whose face had faded beneath years of varnish and sunlight. Ava stared at the painting for several seconds before speaking again. "My grandma said your dad never liked secrets that stayed hidden forever." Claudia's smile tightened almost invisibly. "Your grandmother remembered many things," she replied. "Sometimes memories become stories." Ava didn't argue. She simply reached into the pocket of her worn blue cardigan and gently touched something hidden inside without removing it. Nathaniel noticed the movement but said nothing. Instead, he turned back toward the safe once again. The polished shelves reflected his face, older than he expected to see, carrying weeks of exhaustion after planning a funeral, comforting employees, and sorting through decades of family history. His father's final instructions had seemed complete until this moment. Yet for reasons he couldn't explain, the room no longer felt finished. It felt like the beginning of a conversation someone had interrupted years ago. Nathaniel slowly placed his hand against the inside wall of the safe. The steel felt unexpectedly cool despite the warm summer afternoon outside. He gently tapped once with his knuckles. A solid metallic sound answered. He tapped again slightly lower. The tone changed almost imperceptibly. Ava quietly looked up. "That's the place," she whispered. The room remained perfectly still as Nathaniel pressed his fingertips against the cool steel once again. The second hollow note lingered in his thoughts far longer than it should have. It was faint, almost impossible to notice unless someone had been listening for it, and somehow the smallest person in the room had heard it before anyone else. The attorney stepped closer, offering an apologetic smile. "Mr. Whitmore, these vintage safes often contain reinforced panels. Different sections can produce different sounds. It does not necessarily mean there is another compartment." Nathaniel nodded politely, yet he did not remove his hand. Instead, he slowly traced the inside wall with his fingertips until they reached the lower right corner. The metal felt perfectly smooth except for one tiny ridge that interrupted the polished surface. It was so slight that it disappeared beneath his finger unless he deliberately searched for it. Claudia noticed him pausing. "Nathaniel," she said gently, "Father spent years organizing everything. If there had been another compartment, the inspection team would have documented it months ago." Her calm voice carried confidence, but Ava quietly watched Claudia instead of the safe. She noticed how the woman clasped her hands just a little tighter every time Nathaniel looked back inside. Denise placed a reassuring hand on Ava's shoulder, silently reminding her not to interrupt again. Ava understood. She lowered her eyes for a moment before speaking softly enough that only Nathaniel could hear. "My mom always says people look at doors. They forget to look at the frame." Nathaniel glanced toward her with quiet curiosity. "What do you mean?" Ava pointed without stepping closer. "The shelves are shiny because everybody keeps looking there. The edge is dusty because nobody touches it." Nathaniel shifted his attention from the empty shelves to the narrow steel border surrounding them. She was right. A thin line of settled dust rested along one section of the frame, while another strip appeared noticeably cleaner, as though something had once moved there. He gently brushed the dust away with his thumb. Beneath it appeared a tiny brass circle no larger than the head of a pencil eraser. It blended almost perfectly into the surrounding metal. The attorney leaned forward, adjusting his glasses again. "I do not recall seeing that." Nathaniel smiled faintly. "Neither did I." Claudia quickly answered before anyone else could continue. "It is probably part of the original manufacturing process." Nathaniel did not respond. Instead, he looked toward Miles Carter, who had served as the Whitmore family attorney for nearly 30 years. "Miles, did my father ever mention modifications to this safe?" The older man frowned thoughtfully. "Not directly. However, I do remember him insisting that this library should never be renovated. He once said the room worked exactly the way he intended." Nathaniel repeated those words silently. Exactly the way he intended. The sentence felt less like nostalgia and more like instructions. Outside the tall windows, a gentle summer breeze stirred the ancient oak trees surrounding the estate. Their shadows drifted across the library walls like slow-moving memories. Nathaniel suddenly remembered being 12 years old, sitting cross-legged on the rug while his father read adventure novels aloud. Charles Whitmore had always hidden small surprises inside ordinary objects. Birthday cards contained folded treasure maps. Desk drawers concealed handwritten riddles. Even Christmas gifts often required solving puzzles before they could be opened. The best things are never left where everyone expects to find them, his father used to laugh. Nathaniel's heartbeat slowed as another memory surfaced. His father had never trusted ordinary locks. He trusted observation. Ava quietly watched recognition spread across Nathaniel's face. She did not know what memory had returned to him, but she could see it changing the way he looked at the safe. He was no longer searching for money. He was searching for intention. Denise gently whispered, "Ava, how did you notice the sound?" Ava smiled shyly. "When Grandma polished the library years ago, she always told me old rooms speak if you stop talking long enough." Denise smiled despite herself. Those words had belonged to Ava's grandmother for as long as anyone could remember. Nathaniel looked back toward the brass circle hidden beneath the dust. Instead of pressing it, he carefully examined the surrounding frame. There, almost invisible beneath decades of polish, ran an impossibly thin seam outlining what appeared to be an entirely separate steel panel concealed inside the larger safe. It was masterfully crafted. Even standing inches away, he could barely distinguish it from the rest of the interior. Miles inhaled quietly. "Remarkable." Claudia folded her arms again, though her expression had lost some of its easy confidence. "Even if that is another panel, it could simply protect the back wall." Nathaniel slowly nodded. "Perhaps." His voice remained calm, but something had changed. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed a clean white handkerchief. Instead of touching the brass circle directly, he carefully wiped away the remaining dust surrounding it. As the powder disappeared, delicate engraved letters emerged around the tiny circle, almost erased by time. The inscription was barely large enough to read, yet every person standing nearby leaned forward in silence. Nathaniel whispered the words aloud. "For the one who chooses to look twice." No one spoke after that. Even the grandfather clock seemed louder than before as its steady ticking echoed through the library. Nathaniel slowly looked toward Ava. The little girl simply offered a quiet smile, as though she had never doubted that the room had been waiting for someone willing to listen instead of assuming it had already revealed every secret. No one reached for the tiny brass circle. The discovery itself seemed almost sacred, as though even breathing too loudly might disturb whatever Charles Whitmore had intended to remain hidden until the right moment. Nathaniel rested his hand against the edge of the safe and studied the delicate inscription once again. "For the one who chooses to look twice." Those words did not sound like instructions from a businessman protecting wealth. They sounded like a lesson from a father who had always believed that character mattered more than possessions. Miles Carter stepped closer, his weathered face reflecting both curiosity and disbelief. "Charles had unusual habits," he said quietly. "He believed every important decision deserved a second look. I always thought it was simply one of his sayings." Nathaniel nodded slowly. Perhaps it was more than that. Claudia folded her arms, her expression carefully controlled despite the growing uncertainty in the room. "Even if another compartment exists, it may contain nothing more than old family keepsakes. We have already completed the estate inventory." Nathaniel looked toward her without irritation. "Then opening it should settle every question." Claudia answered with a pleasant smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Of course." Ava remained silent near the bookshelf. Her attention was no longer fixed on the safe itself, but on the library around it. The room felt strangely familiar, even though she had visited it only a handful of times years before while waiting for her grandmother to finish work. She remembered being told never to touch the books, never to move the decorations, and always to leave everything exactly where it belonged. Her grandmother had smiled whenever she repeated those rules. "When a room has been loved for many years," she used to say, "every object knows its place." Ava's eyes wandered across the carved oak shelves until they stopped on a bronze owl resting beside a row of leather-bound history books. She frowned slightly. The little statue faced away from the safe, while every framed photograph and decorative piece in the library seemed carefully arranged toward the center of the room. It felt strangely out of place. Nathaniel gently pressed the brass circle with one finger. Nothing happened. He tried again, with slightly firmer pressure. The safe remained perfectly still. Miles examined the mechanism thoughtfully. It may require a sequence rather than force. Nathaniel withdrew his hand. His father had always disliked shortcuts. Every puzzle he created depended upon patience instead of strength. He carefully examined the engraved letters once more, tracing each word with his eyes rather than his fingers. Ava suddenly spoke, her voice soft but confident. Maybe. It is waiting for something else. Everyone turned toward her again. Nathaniel smiled warmly. What makes you think that? Ava looked toward the old bronze owl. Because if somebody wanted people to push that button, they would make it easy to see. Your dad wanted somebody to notice everything, not just one thing. Nathaniel followed her gaze until he saw the owl. The small sculpture had occupied that shelf for as long as he could remember. As a child, he had often played with it while Charles organized papers at the large writing desk nearby. He even remembered his father laughing once because he had accidentally turned the owl backward. The wise bird always watches the truth, Charles had said before rotating it toward the fireplace again. Nathaniel slowly walked across the library. Dust shimmered beneath the afternoon sunlight as he reached the shelf. The bronze owl felt unexpectedly heavy when he wrapped his hand around it. Its base had worn smooth from years of polishing. He gently turned the statue toward the safe. A quiet metallic click echoed through the room. No one moved. The sound was faint, but this time everyone heard it. Miles looked toward Nathaniel with astonishment. Claudia's smile disappeared for the briefest moment before she quickly composed herself again. Nathaniel returned to the safe without rushing. He pressed the tiny brass circle once more. This time the hidden steel panel released with a soft mechanical whisper and shifted outward less than half an inch. A collective breath filled the library. Nathaniel carefully gripped the edge of the concealed panel and slowly pulled it open. Behind it rested a small velvet-lined compartment no larger than a shoebox. There were no stacks of cash, no glittering jewelry, no gold bars. Instead, lying neatly in the center was a worn brown envelope tied with a faded blue ribbon, a polished brass key unlike any Nathaniel had ever seen, and a leather notebook whose cover carried only two embossed initials. C.W. Nathaniel stared silently at the simple collection. Somehow it felt more valuable than anything he had expected to find. Miles removed his glasses and quietly shook his head. I searched every record Charles ever gave me, he whispered. He never mentioned this. Nathaniel reached toward the envelope, but stopped just before touching it. He noticed a short handwritten message across the front in his father's unmistakable script. The ink had faded slightly with age, yet every letter remained clear. It read, "If you have found this, someone finally remembered to listen." Nathaniel slowly looked toward Ava. The little girl lowered her eyes shyly, almost embarrassed by the attention. Denise wrapped an arm gently around her shoulders, still unable to understand how her daughter had noticed what generations of adults had overlooked. The grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm across the library as the afternoon sunlight grew warmer, and for the first time since Charles Whitmore's funeral, Nathaniel no longer felt as though he was reading the final chapter of his father's life. He felt as though the Real story had only just begun. The faded blue ribbon remained perfectly tied around the weathered envelope as Nathaniel held it with both hands. For several long seconds, no one urged him to open it. The silence itself felt like part of his father's final lesson. He carefully loosened the ribbon and unfolded the thick paper inside. The familiar handwriting immediately brought back memories of countless handwritten birthday cards, holiday notes, and quiet words of encouragement that Charles Whitmore had always preferred over expensive gifts. Nathaniel began reading silently, but after only a few lines he paused, his expression changing from curiosity to quiet disbelief. Miles noticed first. "Nathaniel," he asked gently, "what did Charles write?" Nathaniel looked up slowly before reading aloud. "If this letter has reached your hands, then someone beside you saw what others overlooked. Trust that person before you trust anyone who insists the search is already over." Every eye in the library instinctively shifted toward Ava. The little girl lowered her head, suddenly uncomfortable beneath so much attention. Denise gently squeezed her daughter's shoulder, offering silent reassurance. Nathaniel continued reading. "The greatest fortune I leave behind cannot be measured inside a bank. It belongs to those willing to protect truth even when it appears ordinary." Claudia released a small breath and smiled politely. Father always enjoyed speaking in riddles. Nathaniel lowered the letter. He rarely wasted words. Claudia stepped closer, maintaining her composed tone. Nathaniel, this is obviously sentimental. Father loved puzzles. That does not mean every hidden envelope contains another mystery. Nathaniel studied her face for a moment before answering. Perhaps, but he specifically expected someone to discover this after everyone else believed the search was finished. Miles slowly nodded. That detail concerns me as well. Claudia turned toward the attorney with practiced confidence. Surely you are not suggesting the official estate review was somehow incomplete. Miles chose his words carefully. I am suggesting Charles intentionally withheld something from every legal document I reviewed. The statement settled heavily over the room. Nathaniel carefully reached back into the hidden compartment and lifted out the leather notebook. Its cover was worn smooth from years of handling, but the brass clasp remained locked. Beside it rested the unusual brass key they had found moments earlier. The key looked handcrafted rather than manufactured, its head engraved with an elegant oak tree whose branches spread across the polished metal. Nathaniel held it beneath the afternoon light. This does not belong to the safe, he murmured. Miles leaned closer. No, I have never seen that design before. Ava quietly watched the oak tree engraved on the key. Something about it stirred a distant memory. She frowned as she searched her thoughts. Then her eyes suddenly widened. I have seen that tree. Everyone looked toward her again. Claudia's pleasant expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Nathaniel knelt, so they stood at eye level once more. Where? Ava hesitated only long enough to be certain. On the little box in the greenhouse. Denise blinked in surprise. Ava, we have not been near the greenhouse in years. Ava nodded. Grandma took me there one time because Mr. Whitmore wanted fresh flowers. There was a wooden box on a shelf with the same tree carved on top. Nathaniel searched his memory. The estate greenhouse had been closed for several years after his father's health declined. He had not entered it since the previous spring. Are you certain? Ava nodded firmly. The tree had the same funny branch that bends to the left. Nathaniel examined the key again. She was right. One branch curved differently from the others, an unusual detail that would have been impossible to invent. Claudia spoke before anyone else could respond. There are hundreds of decorative carvings around this estate. Children often connect things that only look similar. Ava did not argue. She simply looked back at Nathaniel with the same calm certainty she had shown since the beginning. Nathaniel stood slowly. Perhaps she is mistaken. Claudia smiled with visible relief. Exactly. Nathaniel continued before she could say anything else. But my father always told me that certainty should be tested, not dismissed. Claudia's smile faded once again. Miles quietly folded his glasses and slipped them into his jacket pocket. I believe Charles would expect us to verify every clue before reaching conclusions. Nathaniel carefully returned the letter to its envelope, but kept the brass key in his hand. His eyes drifted toward the tall library windows overlooking the distant gardens. Beyond the rolling lawn stood the old greenhouse, its glass roof reflecting the late afternoon sun beneath towering maple trees. For years it had simply been another forgotten building on the estate. Now it seemed to be waiting. Denise gently whispered to Ava, "How did you remember the carving?" Ava looked toward the windows. Because Grandma told me that trees remember people even after people forget places. Nathaniel smiled faintly. Those words sounded remarkably similar to the lessons his own father had spent a lifetime teaching. Two families from completely different worlds had somehow passed along the same quiet wisdom. He slipped the brass key carefully into his jacket pocket before closing the hidden compartment once more. The library no longer felt like the end of an inheritance. It felt like the first doorway into a promise. Charles Whitmore had protected for years, waiting for someone patient enough to notice what everyone else had already decided was invisible. The walk from the library to the gardens happened almost without discussion. Nathaniel carried the worn envelope beneath one arm, while the brass key rested securely inside his jacket pocket. Miles followed quietly beside him, his thoughtful expression growing more serious with every step across the marble foyer. Behind them, Denise gently held Ava's hand as the little girl looked through the tall windows toward the distant greenhouse. Claudia walked several paces behind the group, her graceful smile never completely disappearing, although she spoke far less than she had only minutes before. Outside, the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the carefully trimmed lawns. The fountain at the center of the estate reflected golden light, while a gentle breeze carried the scent of roses and freshly cut grass through the warm summer air. It was the kind of peaceful afternoon Charles Whitmore had always loved. Nathaniel remembered countless evenings when his father would leave important business meetings early simply to walk these same stone paths before sunset. He used to say that gardens reminded people to slow down because flowers never rushed to bloom. As they approached the old greenhouse, the glass walls shimmered beneath the sunlight like a forgotten memory, waiting patiently for someone to return. Ivy climbed across one side of the structure, softening the weathered brick foundation that had supported it for decades. The building had clearly been maintained even after it stopped growing rare orchids and exotic plants for the estate. The windows remained clean. The brass door handle still gleamed. Someone had cared for this place long after everyone else had stopped paying attention to it. Nathaniel paused before opening the door. "Who has been maintaining the greenhouse?" he asked. Miles thought for a moment. "Groundskeeping handles the exterior, but your father always instructed that the interior remain untouched unless he gave permission personally." Nathaniel looked at him with quiet surprise. "Even after he became ill?" Miles nodded. "Especially after he became ill." Claudia folded her arms lightly. "Father was sentimental about many places on the property." Nathaniel rested one hand on the polished brass handle. Perhaps for a reason. The door opened with surprising ease. Warm air carrying the fragrance of rich soil, lavender, and blooming jasmine drifted gently toward them. Sunlight filtered through the glass ceiling, illuminating rows of carefully arranged plants that seemed frozen in time. Wooden benches lined the pathways, while hanging baskets overflowed with green vines reaching toward the light. Nothing appeared abandoned. Instead, the greenhouse felt quietly preserved, as though someone expected its owner to return at any moment. Ava stepped inside slowly, her eyes moving across the room with quiet fascination. Then she stopped. "There," she whispered. On a shelf beneath the largest window rested a modest cedar box no larger than a shoebox. Dust covered the surrounding pots. Yet the little box itself appeared noticeably cleaner, its polished lid reflecting a narrow beam of sunlight. Nathaniel approached without haste. As he drew closer, he saw the carved oak tree exactly as Ava had described it. One branch curved gently toward the left, matching the engraving on the brass key perfectly. He looked down at the little girl with genuine admiration. "You remembered every detail." Ava smiled shyly. "Grandma always said that if something is important, your eyes remember it before your mind does." Denise looked at her daughter with quiet pride. She had heard those words many times herself, but had never imagined they would one day guide the future of the Whitmore family. Nathaniel carefully removed the brass key from his pocket. For a brief moment, he simply held it beside the carving. The shapes aligned perfectly, as though they had been created together. Miles quietly exhaled. Charles planned this with extraordinary care. Nathaniel slowly inserted the key into the hidden lock beneath the carved tree. It fit without resistance. He turned it once. A soft click echoed through the greenhouse. The lid rose less than an inch on its own before stopping gently. No complicated mechanism. No dramatic surprise. Only quiet certainty. Nathaniel lifted the lid completely. Inside rested a neatly folded linen cloth protecting a single leather document case, sealed with dark green wax. Beside it lay an old black and white photograph showing a much younger Charles Whitmore standing beside several employees outside the very same greenhouse. Nathaniel immediately recognized one familiar face. "That is your grandmother," he said softly, looking toward Ava. Denise stepped closer in astonishment. There, smiling beside Charles Whitmore, stood Ava's grandmother decades earlier, holding a basket of flowers while Charles laughed about something outside the frame. On the back of the photograph, written in Charles's careful handwriting, were only 8 words. "Some promises grow quietly until someone finally remembers them." Nathaniel looked from the photograph to Ava. The discovery no longer felt accidental. His father had connected these lives long before anyone standing in the greenhouse understood why, and whatever waited inside the sealed leather case was no longer simply part of an inheritance. It had become part of a promise that had survived the passing of time itself. Nathaniel held the sealed leather document case with extraordinary care, almost as though he feared the passage of time itself might crumble beneath his fingertips. The dark green wax seal remained perfectly intact, carrying the same engraved oak tree that had guided them from the hidden compartment in the library to the quiet greenhouse. No one spoke as he carefully broke the seal. The gentle crack echoed through the glass room with surprising clarity. Inside rested several neatly organized documents, each protected inside transparent sleeves, along with a smaller handwritten journal bound in dark brown leather. Miles stepped forward instinctively. His decades of legal experience immediately recognized official trust certificates, notarized signatures, and corporate filings unlike any he had reviewed during the settlement of Charles Whitmore's estate. Nathaniel slowly removed the first document. Across the top, printed in bold letters, were the words Whitmore Community Legacy Trust. His eyes narrowed with confusion. I have never seen this. Miles accepted the document with careful hands. His expression changed almost immediately. Neither have I. He turned several pages slowly, his breathing growing noticeably quieter. Nathaniel, this trust was established almost 18 years ago. Claudia looked genuinely puzzled. That cannot be correct. Father disclosed every charitable foundation to the family accountants. Miles continued reading without looking up. Apparently not this one. Nathaniel accepted another folder from the case. Inside were property deeds, investment statements, and annual reports documenting remarkable financial growth over nearly 2 decades. The numbers were substantial, yet the documents revealed something even more surprising. Every dividend had been reinvested. Every property had appreciated. Every account had remained untouched. Charles Whitmore had quietly built an independent fortune completely separate from the publicly known Whitmore family holdings. Denise stared at the pages in disbelief. He kept all of this hidden? Miles nodded slowly. Not hidden forever. Hidden until the right moment. Nathaniel opened the leather journal next. Unlike the official documents, every page had been written entirely by hand. The first sentence immediately captured everyone's attention. If you are reading this, then the person standing beside you has already proven more valuable than the fortune itself. Nathaniel paused before continuing. His eyes drifted toward Ava. The little girl stood quietly beside a flowering jasmine vine, completely unaware that every adult in the greenhouse had begun seeing her differently. She had not solved the mystery through luck. She had simply listened more carefully than everyone else. Nathaniel continued reading aloud. Money protects comfort. Character protects people. Never confuse the two. Miles closed his eyes briefly. That sounds exactly like Charles. Several pages later, another handwritten entry caught Nathaniel's attention. It described the purpose of the trust in remarkable detail. Charles had created the organization to provide scholarships, housing assistance, and educational opportunities for working families who had quietly supported the Whitmore estate across multiple generations. He believed loyalty deserved opportunity, not merely gratitude. Every employee who had faithfully served the family appeared to have been included in handwritten notes throughout the journal. Gardeners, drivers, secretaries, housekeepers, maintenance workers. Each name carried personal observations about kindness, honesty, perseverance, or sacrifice. Denise slowly covered her mouth with one hand as Nathaniel reached a familiar page. Margaret Brooks, he read softly. Ava's grandmother. Charles had written nearly an entire page describing her unwavering integrity. He recalled finding an envelope containing several $1,000s that had accidentally been misplaced after a fundraising event many years earlier. Rather than quietly returning it, Margaret had stayed late into the evening personally, helping him identify where every dollar belonged before leaving the estate that night. At the bottom of the page, Charles had written one final sentence. If my family ever loses its way, ask Margaret to remind them what honesty sounds like. Denise felt tears gathering in her eyes, though she smiled through them. She never told us that story. Ava looked up at her mother with quiet surprise. Grandma always said doing the right thing was supposed to stay quiet. Nathaniel closed the journal gently. The words lingered in the greenhouse long after they had been spoken. This hidden fortune suddenly seemed far less important than the values carefully preserved beside it. Yet one question remained unanswered. Why had Charles required such an elaborate series of clues to reveal something he clearly wanted discovered? Miles continued reviewing the legal papers until he suddenly stopped. He adjusted his glasses twice before speaking. Nathaniel, there is another condition. Nathaniel looked toward him immediately. What kind of condition? Miles slowly lifted the final notarized page. The trust cannot be activated by inheritance alone. Claudia frowned. What does that mean? Miles swallowed quietly before reading the final paragraph aloud. The acting trustee must first identify the person whose honesty uncovered the hidden trust. That individual shall become the founding guardian of the Whitmore Community Legacy Trust alongside the family representative. Silence settled over the greenhouse once again. Nathaniel slowly turned toward Ava. The little girl simply looked back with innocent curiosity, unaware that Charles Whitmore had planned for her role long before she had ever whispered a single word inside the old library. The words remained suspended in the warm greenhouse ere long after Miles finished reading the final condition. Nathaniel lowered his eyes toward the weathered journal, then slowly looked back at Ava. She stood quietly beside her mother, gently brushing one fingertip across the smooth edge of a flower pot, completely unaware of the significance Charles Whitmore had attached to her simple honesty. Denise finally found her voice. There has to be some misunderstanding. Ava is only 8 years old. Miles carefully reread the paragraph before shaking his head. Charles chose every word with precision. He did not appoint her because of her age. He appointed her because she uncovered what everyone else overlooked. Claudia stepped forward with measured confidence. Surely Father meant the family should recognize her kindness, not place legal responsibility beside the Whitmore name. Miles folded the document slowly. The paperwork does not transfer financial authority to a child. It establishes a symbolic founding guardian whose honesty becomes the moral foundation of the trust. The operational responsibilities remain with the acting trustee. Nathaniel quietly nodded. My father believed symbols matter because they remind people why something exists. Claudia offered a composed smile. Then perhaps we should honor the sentiment privately and continue organizing the trust through the family office. Nathaniel looked toward the greenhouse windows without answering immediately. Beyond the glass, the estate stretched peacefully beneath the fading afternoon sun. Garden paths curved through rows of blooming hydrangeas exactly as they had throughout his childhood. His father had walked those paths with gardeners more often than with executives. At the time, Nathaniel had never understood why. Now, every memory seemed to fit together like pieces of a puzzle patiently waiting decades to be completed. He turned another page inside the journal. Several folded sheets slipped gently onto the cedar table. One page contained handwritten names arranged beneath a simple heading. The first circle. Miles carefully gathered the pages before the breeze could scatter them. Every name belonged to someone who had once worked quietly behind the scenes at Whitmore Manor. Some had already retired. Others had passed away years earlier. Beside each name, Charles had written a single sentence describing an act of integrity that had impressed him. Returning lost property. Protecting another employee from unfair blame. Working through severe winter storms to keep the estate running. Staying late to help someone without expecting recognition. Nathaniel smiled sadly as he realized none of the entries mentioned business success, investment returns, or prestigious achievements. Every story celebrated ordinary goodness. Ava slowly stepped closer, careful not to interrupt. Mr. Whitmore? Nathaniel looked up warmly. Yes, Ava. She pointed toward the final page. There is another paper underneath. Nathaniel carefully lifted the remaining sheets. Hidden beneath them rested a sealed envelope much smaller than the others. Across the front, written in Charles Whitmore's familiar handwriting, appeared only 4 words. To be opened together. Miles examined the envelope thoughtfully. Interesting. Nathaniel smiled faintly. Father never liked people solving important things alone. He looked around the greenhouse. Then we will read it together. He gently opened the envelope and unfolded a single handwritten page. The message was brief. If you have reached this point, then the trust has already succeeded once. A child noticed what adults dismissed. Remember that every decision you make from this day forward must leave room for voices that experience often overlooks. Wealth grows through investment. Wisdom grows through listening. Nathaniel lowered the page slowly. No one spoke for several moments. Even Claudia remained silent. The greenhouse seemed unusually peaceful, filled only with the distant song of birds settling into the nearby maple trees. Denise looked toward her daughter with quiet emotion. Ava, how did you know to keep paying attention? Ava shrugged gently. Grandma always said listening costs nothing, so you should never be too rich to do it. Nathaniel quietly laughed for the first time that day. The sound surprised even him. Your grandmother and my father would have been wonderful partners. Miles nodded with a smile. I believe they already were. Suddenly, Nathaniel noticed something else resting inside the now empty leather case. Tucked beneath the lining was a small ivory card almost hidden from view. He carefully removed it. On one side was the familiar oak tree. On the other was an address written in Charles's handwriting. It was not a business office, a bank, or another Whitmore property. It was a modest building in downtown Hartford identified only as the Whitmore Community House. Nathaniel frowned thoughtfully. I have never heard of this place. Miles looked genuinely surprised. Neither have I, and I have handled Charles's affairs for 3 decades. Claudia glanced briefly at the address before looking away. Perhaps it was another charitable project that never opened. Nathaniel slipped the card carefully into the journal. Or perhaps it is the place Father expected us to visit next. As the evening sunlight poured through the greenhouse glass, casting long golden shadows across the cedar table, Nathaniel realized the hidden fortune had never been leading them toward greater wealth. Every clue pointed instead toward forgotten people, quiet promises, and places built not to impress the world, but to quietly change it. And for the first time since his father's passing, he felt certain that the greatest inheritance Charles Whitmore had left behind was still waiting to be discovered. The drive to downtown Hartford took just under an hour, yet the quiet inside Nathaniel's vehicle made the journey feel suspended outside of time. The leather journal rested on the center console beside the ivory card, while the brass key remained safely inside his jacket pocket. Miles sat in the front passenger seat reviewing copies of the trust documents once more. Denise and Ava occupied the back seat, watching neighborhoods gradually replace tree-lined estates as the city skyline appeared against the fading evening sky. Claudia followed behind in her own car, without saying much after leaving Whitmore Manor. None of them knew exactly what they expected to find at the address Charles Whitmore had carefully concealed for so many years. When the navigation finally announced their arrival, Nathaniel slowed the vehicle beside a modest red brick building standing quietly between a neighborhood library and a small public park. A simple wooden sign above the entrance read Whitmore Community House. There were no polished marble columns, no dramatic entrance, and no display celebrating the Whitmore family name. Flower boxes rested beneath every window, bicycles leaned against a nearby fence, and children's drawings decorated the inside of the front glass door. Laughter drifted through an open window along with the warm scent of fresh bread. Nathaniel remained seated for a long moment, staring at the building. Father owned this, he asked softly. Miles looked through the windshield with visible surprise. According to these documents, yes. For almost 18 years. Denise quietly smiled. It feels alive. Ava looked toward the front entrance where an elderly man was watering colorful flowers beside the steps. He looks happy. Nathaniel stepped out first. The evening air carried the pleasant sounds of children playing basketball across the street while birds settled onto telephone wires overhead. As he approached the entrance, the elderly man turned, set down the watering can, and smiled warmly. Good evening, he said. Can I help you? Nathaniel introduced himself politely. The man's expression softened immediately, though there was no shock in his eyes. Only recognition. You have your father's smile, he said gently. We wondered when you might finally arrive. Nathaniel exchanged a surprised glance with Miles. You were expecting us? The man nodded. Mr. Whitmore always said the day would come when someone followed the oak tree instead of the money. He extended his hand. My name is Samuel Foster. I have managed this community house since your father opened it. Nathaniel shook his hand firmly. Why was none of this included with the estate? Samuel smiled kindly. Because your father believed a mission should introduce itself before paperwork ever could. He pushed open the front door. Please come inside. The building felt welcoming rather than impressive. Families gathered around long tables finishing dinner together. Volunteers sorted donated books onto neatly labeled shelves. A young music teacher quietly helped several children practice piano in a nearby room, while colorful artwork covered nearly every hallway wall. No one seemed concerned about the arrival of a billionaire. Instead, they greeted Samuel with cheerful waves before returning to their conversations. Ava slowly walked beside Nathaniel, her eyes wide with quiet wonder. "Everybody knows each other," she whispered. Samuel overheard her and smiled. That was Mr. Whitmore's favorite rule. No strangers leave this place feeling invisible. Nathaniel looked around carefully. Framed photographs lined one hallway, documenting years of neighborhood events, scholarship ceremonies, holiday dinners, tutoring sessions, and community gardens. Charles Whitmore appeared in many of the older pictures, never standing at the center. Sometimes he was serving meals beside volunteers. Sometimes he was planting flowers with children. Sometimes he simply sat listening while elderly neighbors shared stories over coffee. Nathaniel stopped before one particular photograph. His father stood beside Margaret Brooks, Ava's grandmother, smiling proudly as several teenagers held certificates of achievement. Samuel noticed where Nathaniel's attention had settled. "Margaret volunteered here every Saturday for nearly 12 years, he said. Denise looked at the photograph in complete astonishment. "My mother told us she was helping friends at church." Samuel laughed softly. "She always preferred talking about other people instead of herself." Ava looked up at the smiling image of her grandmother. "She never told me." Samuel knelt beside her. "Some of the kindest people never do." Miles quietly approached another display case containing dozens of handwritten letters. Each one came from former scholarship recipients thanking the community house for helping them attend college, start businesses, become teachers, nurses, firefighters, engineers, and social workers. Every letter ended with nearly the same sentence. "Someone believed in me before I believed in myself." Nathaniel slowly realized that the hidden fortune had already been changing lives for nearly 2 decades without anyone associating it with the Whitmore name. Charles had quietly invested in people instead of publicity. Samuel gently placed one hand on the leather journal Nathaniel carried. "Your father asked me to tell you one thing if you ever arrived with that book." Nathaniel looked at him attentively. Samuel smiled with calm certainty. "He said that when you finally reached this building, you would understand that the greatest inheritance was never hidden inside a safe. It was hidden inside the lives that kindness quietly transformed, one family at a time." Samuel led the group into a quiet meeting room at the back of the community house, where evening sunlight streamed through wide windows and settled gently across a long wooden table scarred by years of shared meals, homework sessions, and neighborhood gatherings. The room carried no signs of luxury, yet every chair had clearly welcomed thousands of conversations. Nathaniel slowly placed Charles Whitmore's journal beside the framed photograph of Margaret Brooks and looked around without speaking. Every corner of the building reflected purpose instead of prestige. Children's paintings covered one wall. Shelves of donated books filled another. A bulletin board displayed handwritten thank you notes from families whose lives had quietly changed because someone had believed they deserved another opportunity. Samuel opened a cabinet and removed a simple wooden box bearing the familiar carved oak tree. "Your father asked me never to open this unless someone arrived carrying both the journal and the brass key." Nathaniel reached into his jacket pocket and placed the key on the table. Samuel unlocked the box with steady hands. Inside rested one final letter, neatly folded beside a fountain pen and a framed certificate establishing the Whitmore Community Legacy Trust under its original charter. Nathaniel unfolded the letter carefully. Charles Whitmore's handwriting appeared as steady as ever. "Nathaniel, if you have reached this room, then you finally understand why I chose the longest path instead of the easiest one. Money can be inherited in a single afternoon. Values must be discovered one decision at a time. If a child guided you here, do not thank luck. Thank the quiet courage that still exists in this world. Protect it. Listen to it. Learn from it. That will be the greatest return any investment can ever produce." Nathaniel paused, his voice growing softer as he reached the final lines. "The trust belongs to every honest heart willing to leave the next generation with more hope than fear. Sign your name only after you understand that truth." Silence filled the room once again. Miles removed the founding documents from the wooden box and compared them with the legal papers they had discovered earlier. Every signature matched. Every requirement had been satisfied. "Nathaniel," he said quietly, "everything is ready. The trust has been waiting for this day for many years." Nathaniel picked up the fountain pen, but did not sign immediately. Instead, he looked toward Ava. The little girl stood beside the window watching several children laugh together in the community garden outside. Their joyful voices drifted through the open screen, mixing with the gentle rustling of leaves in the warm evening breeze. Nathaniel walked over and knelt beside her. Ava, do you know why my father wanted someone like you to help uncover all of this? She thought for a moment before answering. Maybe because grown-ups get busy. Nathaniel smiled. I think you are right. Ava looked back toward the children outside. Grandma always said people miss beautiful things when they hurry. Nathaniel nodded slowly. Your grandmother was a very wise woman. He stood, returned to the table, and signed the founding document with calm certainty. Then he handed the pen to Samuel. The trust continues exactly as my father intended. No changes to its purpose. No changes to the families it serves. We simply help more people. Samuel accepted the pen with grateful eyes before adding his own signature as witness. Miles completed the remaining legal documents while Denise quietly wiped away happy tears she could no longer hide. Claudia had remained unusually silent throughout the evening. At last, she stepped toward Nathaniel. Her voice carried none of the confidence it had held inside the library earlier that day. I spent years believing Father measured success by what he built. Nathaniel looked at the bustling community house beyond the meeting room door. Volunteers prepared tomorrow's breakfast program while students packed their backpacks after evening tutoring sessions. He did, Nathaniel answered gently. We simply misunderstood what he was building. Claudia slowly nodded, her expression softening as she looked toward Ava. Thank you, she said sincerely. Ava blinked in surprise. For what? Claudia smiled, this time without pretense. For reminding all of us to look twice. As the last rays of sunlight settled across the oak tree carved into the wooden box, Nathaniel carefully placed Charles Whitmore's journal inside beside the photograph of Margaret Brooks. He left the lid open. Some stories, he realized, were never meant to be locked away again. Before leaving, he walked outside with Ava to the small community garden where children had planted flowers in carefully marked rows. Nathaniel knelt beside a young oak sapling growing near the entrance. A small brass plaque rested at its base. It read, "The strongest trees begin with unseen roots." Ava smiled as she gently touched one of the bright green leaves. It is going to be really big someday. Nathaniel looked from the tiny tree to the community house filled with quiet kindness, then toward the evening sky glowing above Hartford. Yes, he said softly. Because someone remembered to care for it before everyone else noticed it was growing. Together, they walked back toward the front door, not as strangers from different worlds, but as two people forever. Connected by one quiet whisper, one hidden promise, and one extraordinary lesson that would continue changing lives long after the secrets had all been found.